It is often the case that Daniel 11, especially key areas are misinterpreted. And we're going to just look at a few examples. All right? Failure to apply proper principles sometimes. On Friday nights, we're looking at Bible interpretation principles. And sometimes failure to apply sound principles of prophetic interpretation has led to unsatisfactory interpretations. Let me just give a few illustrations. Before we go, like I said, we're going to spend the first part of this lesson just laying foundations. Just a few examples of illustrations where you find that popular interpretation has gone awry. Daniel 11:17 says, "He shall give him the daughter of women, corrupting her." Now, almost every commentator, many within Adventism and many outside of Adventism, almost every commentator has concluded that this refers to Caesar's relation with Cleopatra. We reasonably have to question whether God would give so much prominence, so much attention to a sordid love affair between Caesar and Cleopatra, a corrupt woman. You see, Cleopatra's life is more in the taste of a Hollywood film than a heavenly vision. And he said, corrupting her. The simple fact is that Caesar did not corrupt Cleopatra. But as is well known, she, being already corrupt, set out to seduce the Roman general when we look at the history of this, right? So if a person adheres to the theme, notice the theme of Daniel's last prophecy, chapter 11, then it's not difficult to identify the daughter of woman. He shall give him the daughter of women, corrupting her. Understand this. We will go in and we will see these things as we go through the chapter. Verse 37 of Daniel 11 says, "Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any God." Now, this expression, the desire of women, is generally interpreted to mean either celibacy of the Roman clergy. It said, shall not have the desire of women or desire for women. And many times you hear prophetic teachers will say this has to do with the papacy and the celibacy of the Roman clergy. The priests are not allowed to be married, or sexual licentiousness, whatever, which prevailed during the French Revolution. You have different topics, right? But none of these interpretations fits the context either. Because if you notice, the context is describing objects of worship. He shall not, neither shall he regard the God of his fathers. Then it has this statement, nor the desire of women, nor regard any God. Think about this. The context is God's object of worship. Why would he say, he shall not regard the God of his fathers, nor any God, and in between it tells us something about celibacy of the papacy? How does that fit in? That would be a gross violation of context, of contextual integrity right there. But when you look at the correct translation, he says, mean the desire for women. Notice where it says, the Revised Standard Version says the beloved by women. Now that fits perfectly. Who is the beloved by women? Women meaning churches. Who is the beloved by women? Jesus Christ. And it fits in the context. Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor Jesus Christ, the desire of women, of churches, nor regard any God. It fits perfectly because the context here is flowing about gods. You don't put celibacy in the middle of that. So the desire of women, and it goes on. So in other words, what it's saying in verse 37, it's confirming what the Apostle Paul wrote in 2 Thessalonians 2, when he speaks of the papacy. He shall exalt himself above all that is called God, so that he as God sits in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. That is what verse 37 is confirming. So the desire of women is not talking about the celibacy of the Catholic priest. It's talking about regard the God of heaven, Jesus Christ, nor any other God, because the papacy exalts itself above all gods. That is the context. And your other text, you know, it says, the king of the north shall come against him. That's verse 40. The king of the north shall come against him. Now, Uriah Smith, strangely enough, came up with this king of the north being Turkey. But in verse 29, south means Constantinople. And even after Alexander's kingdom was divided, Turkey was never the king of the north. Some people now in prophecy are identifying Russia as the king of the north in verse 40. And so the entire problem arises from a failure to consider the biblical significance of north. There is the true north and the true king of the north, which is Jehovah God. Jehovah God, his temple sits on Mount Zion on the sides of the north. And what did Satan say? I will be like the Most High. I shall put my throne above the stars of God on the sides of the north. He wants the position of God. But who is Satan working through now as an earthly system? Primarily through the papacy. So you have, by the time you get to verse 40, you have the counterfeit king of the north who exalts himself above all that is called God, when the true king of the north is always God. Turkey, Uriah Smith got to Turkey with this. I don't know where he went there. And then you have another point about verse 45. He shall plant his feet between the seas and whatever, and the glorious holy mountain. The glorious holy mountain is said by some to be this. Some saying it's Palestine over there in the Middle East. Some is saying it is America. This land here is the glorious holy mountain. But we're in for surprises when we come to the glorious holy mountain. So now, just to show that Daniel 11 is being butchered because of a violation of context often enough. Now let's look at something else now before we go to our PowerPoint. Let's spend a little bit more time looking at the theme of the prophecy. Every good story must have a theme. Every good narrative must have a theme. Okay, so Yvonne, Sister Yvonne has her hand up. Sister Yvonne?
Can you explain verse 37 again? I didn't, okay, so verse 37 says, neither shall he regard the God of his fathers. Who's the he? The he is...
They were dealing with papacy.
Sorry?
Roman system. By the time you get up to that part of chapter 11, you're dealing with the papacy, the Roman Catholic religion. And so you know...
I'm sorry, the he regard the God of his fathers is the papacy?
Yeah, we're dealing with the papacy, yes.
Okay. But nor the desire of women. You said something about nor the desire of women, and what was the explanation? It's not, you say it's not talking about the priesthood or, you know, not being married. It was something else.
Yeah, because you've heard that before, right, Sister Yvonne? That has to do with the celibacy of the Catholic priests, right?
So what did you say it was?
No. Have you heard that explanation before?
I can't recall. I know that it's talking about the papacy, but I can't say that I remember.
It's a common explanation out there. But nevertheless, the Catholic Church came out of the falling away of the Christian church. You know, the apostle talks about that in 2 Thessalonians 2, that there will be a falling away of the Christian church. So in other words, the Christian Catholic Church was evolved out of what used to be the apostolic church, which over time became more and more corrupted. By the time of Constantine, it fell away. But the God of the apostolic church, which eventually fell away and turned into the papacy later on, was the God Jehovah, right? Neither shall the papacy regard the God of Jehovah, nor the desire of women, nor regard any gods. It would be a violation of the context. If you're dealing with a God of the fathers, dealing with Jehovah, then you're dealing with any God, and then in between that you put the celibacy of the Catholic priest. You understand? How would it be here? No, neither would he regard the celibacy of the Catholic priest. No, he regards it. That's why it is institutionalized in the papacy. Their priests don't marry. They regard it. It's part of their laws. So number one, it would be an incorrect statement. And to put that there also violates the context. Because the context there, it's dealing with what? Gods. So neither shall he have any regard for Jehovah, neither will he have any regard for Christ. The desire, like as I said, the Revised Standard Version puts it, instead of desire by, it puts it, the beloved by women. The Bible says Christ is the beloved of women, right? Speaking of Christ, refers to that. And there's a part with the scripture which tells us that 7 women in the last days will say to him, we want to wear your garments, we want to take your name, whatever, but we want to eat our own bread. Stuff like that. Christ is the desire of women. Women is prophetically being,
churches, right? You're talking about.
So that cannot have to do with celibacy. The context there is dealing with God. In other words, he's saying that the papacy will come to a point where it exalts itself above God the Father, above Christ, and above all other gods. Does the Bible teach us that someplace else? Yes. In 2 Thessalonians 2, where the Apostle Paul, speaking of the papacy, says he will exalt himself above all that is called God, so that he, as God, sits in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. You see what I'm saying? So that very popular statement that has to do with celibacy, it's incorrect and it violates the context. It's dealing with Christ, the desire, the beloved by women.
Well, does women here
Churches.
signify churches, right? Okay.
Because he's the one that all the churches claim to be serving, even though they want their own bread, but they want his name and they want his righteousness.
That's Isaiah 4, verse 1.
Okay.
Yes. All right. Another thing, like I was saying, every good narrative must have a theme. It's just like if you read a book and you don't get the main point of the book, you've missed the whole thing. If you listen to a sermon and you don't get the main point of the sermon or the theme, the central message of it, you've missed the whole thing. Every good narrative must have, every good account, every good story must have a theme. There are 4 prophetic outlines given in the book of Daniel. And there is a theme in each one of them. And over years and years of listening to prophecy and prophetic seminars, and I haven't heard anybody really get into this or the themes of this until a few years ago when I started looking into doing some additional research. It's missed entirely. There's a prophetic outline in chapter 2. There's the image, the beast with all the head of gold, silver, breast and arms of silver, belly and thigh of brass, feet of iron, legs and toe of iron and clay, right? There's a prophetic outline there. There's a parallel outline in chapter 7. You have the lion, the bear, the leopard, and then the great and terrible beast. And then you have another prophetic outline in chapter 8 and 9. 8 and 9 come together as a unit. Another prophetic outline in 8 and 9, and a 4th parallel prophetic outline in chapter 10 to 12. That's why we're touching on a few things, because chapter 11, which we're going to be going into, is actually a part of that flow from chapter 10 to 12. And so there are prophetic outlines, parallel outlines, and we know this. William Miller and James White went to great pains to emphasize the 4 lines of prophecy and to show that they cover the same ground and they enforce the same truth. And they were right. The prophecies of Daniel are a unit. 4 lines of prophetic parallel prophecies. But they have one great theme. Look at most prophecy teachers today who are, say, even within Adventism too, even. And you say, what is the theme of these 4 prophetic parallels in Daniel? What is the theme? Give me in one word. It's very unlikely that you're going to get it. The theme of Daniel's 4 prophetic parallels is restoration. Restoration. And we need to really see this. The theme is restoration. You know, Ellen G. White wrote in Testimonies to Ministers, page 113. And this is what she wrote. She said, consider the circumstances of the Jewish nation when the prophecies of Daniel were given. The armies of Nebuchadnezzar had descended upon the kingdom of Judah. Kingdom, notice what she wrote. Kingdom, king, sanctuary, and people were swept away by the Babylonians. Follow me closely. Kingdom, king, sanctuary and people were swept away by the Babylonians. She continues, Daniel was among those forlorn captives who hung up their harps beside the river of Babylon and refused to sing the songs of Zion. Along with every true-blooded Hebrew, he, that is Daniel, longed for restoration. What was just taken away? Kingdom, king, sanctuary, and people. So what naturally must be restored then? Kingdom, king, sanctuary, and people. You don't hear that when you listen to prophetic outlines of Daniel. You don't. Understand this. In one word, the theme of Daniel's four parallel prophecies is restoration. So through a series of visions, God was revealing to Daniel both the time and the manner of the restoration. In the first vision, what does it end with? The stone that hits the image, and it says the stone became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. What does stone represent? The kingdom of God. In the first vision of chapter 2, you see the restoration of the kingdom. In the second vision, you see the restoration of the king. In chapter 7, Christ comes before the Ancient of Days to receive a kingdom and power and glory. If you have a kingdom, you need a king. And now Christ comes to claim his kingdom. Chapter 7. In the third parallel vision, you have the restoration of the sanctuary. Unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. And Daniel was perplexed. Daniel was perplexed because to the Hebrew mind, the restoration of the kingdom and the king would be unthinkable without a restored sanctuary. So in the vision of Daniel 8, the prophet was shown that the sanctuary would be restored, would be cleansed. Unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be restored. So Daniel was, as we know, was greatly troubled by this information. For he could not understand the relation between the 2,300 days and the 70 years spoken of by Jeremiah. It was coming close to the end of the 70 years, and Daniel was expectant that they were going to be restored to Jerusalem. And the answer was given unto 2,300 days, Daniel knew years, the sanctuary shall be cleansed. This filled him with perplexity. And so earnestly he sought for the meaning of the vision. He could not understand it. And notice, Gabriel came to him. Daniel sought the Lord in prayer that God would not defer to restore the sanctuary. That's in chapter 9 when he's praying in chapter 9. And in the explanation given to him in chapter 9, Daniel is assured that, one, the Jewish sanctuary would be restored at the end of the 70 years because they were set free, right? They were set free. Cyrus had set them free, and they went back to rebuild their city and rebuild their temple. So Daniel was given the assurance that the Jewish sanctuary back there in Jerusalem, yes, just like Jeremiah said, it would be restored. But Daniel was told in Daniel 9:26 that that sanctuary and that temple would once again be destroyed later on. So in other words, that, and after 2,302 weeks, it says, shall the Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And it says, and the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. And the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war, desolations are determined. So that is, hold on, if that's the restoration of the sanctuary, but then down the road, it's going to be destroyed again. What was God trying to show Daniel? Yes, Daniel, as Jeremiah said, the temple in Jerusalem, the sanctuary would be restored in Jerusalem, but that was just a partial restoration. That was not the true sanctuary. It was the real sanctuary, even the one in heaven, that would be restored. It was dealing with the cleansing of the heavenly sanctuary, the beginning of the vindication of God's name, of the judgment. That was what it was dealing with. So what is it dealing with? The cleansing of the sanctuary, the restoration of the sanctuary. And the fourth parallel prophecy of Daniel is the restoration of the people. Notice what the statement we read from Ellen G. White, what it said. The Notice we just read it a while ago. You remember what it said? It said the kingdom, the king, the sanctuary, and people were swept away. And along with every true-blooded Hebrew, he longed for restoration. The fourth parallel prophecy. So Daniel 11 deals with 11 and 12 deals primarily with the restoration of the people. And when we get to that, we will see, you know, at the opening of Daniel 11, you know, the angel said to Daniel, Daniel, that's Daniel 10:14. Now I'm come to make you understand what shall befall your people in the latter days. That's Daniel 10. Daniel 10:14. Remember I said 10, 11, and 12 flow in one. All right? What shall befall your people? So what is the focus of Daniel 11? The restoration of the people. What shall befall the people in the latter days? And at the end of the vision, notice what how the angel described the climax in these words. Daniel chapter 12:1. And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince, which stands for the children of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble such as never was ever since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone that shall be found written in the book. So the restoration of the people of God is the theme of the fourth parallel vision of Daniel. It's not Turkey, it's not Russia, it's not the papacy. And one understand, it's a great mistake to miss these important points as we look into Daniel chapter 11. Amen? So we want to get the theme of Daniel's parallel vision, the restoration of the kingdom, the restoration of the king, the restoration of the sanctuary, and the restoration of the people. So right now, what I'm going to be doing is sharing my screen for a little bit, going into a PowerPoint for a little bit. All right, so we're there. That is the theme of Daniel's fourth prophecy, fourth parallel vision. The theme is restoration. Notice as we go to begin, the restoration of the kingdom, the restoration of the king, the restoration of the sanctuary, and the restoration of the people. There is so much more about that, but that was just like a preamble. So we will come back to that some other point somewhere in the road, down the road. But right now we're going to be looking at Daniel 11, verse by verse. It's entitled Vision by the HIDEKEL. That's the river that Daniel got the vision by. Vision by the HIDEKEL. Now we're going to look at some verses from chapter 10. Right? First, to start on our screen right here, Daniel 10 and verse 4. And in the 24th day of the first month, as I was by the side of the great river, which is HIDEKEL, then I lifted up mine eyes and looked, and behold, a certain man clothed in linen, whose loins were girded with fine gold of Uphaz. So Daniel was seeing Christ in vision. So Daniel chapter 11 covers in considerable detail the long period of, we say, Greco-Roman history. You know, from the Greeks coming down through the Romans and coming down, a long period of history in detail. But Daniel 10 gives a correct insight into what Ellen G. White calls the true philosophy of history. In other words, there are many battles that rage in life, and through history we find many battles. And though many battles rage, there is but one war. It's really one war, you know. Many battles on all different fronts, all through history, but it's really one war. We call it the Great Controversy. Some call it the battle between good and evil, the Great Cosmic Battle, and many other names. It is the great conflict between the forces of good and evil. The controversy of Zion, Isaiah calls it in Isaiah 34 and verse 8, the controversy of Zion. And the angel said to Daniel in Daniel 10:14, "Now I am come to make thee understand what shall befall thy people in the latter days." 4 great lessons. We read the book of Daniel, and there are 4 great lessons that we want to learn that they're intended to teach us. We talked about the 4 parallel prophecies and the theme of each prophecy, all centered under the idea of restoration. But there are great lessons in the book of Daniel, and we want to get 4 lessons out of that too. Because Notice there, number one, God gave dominion to Nebuchadnezzar, but that authority did not include the conscience of his subjects. Lesson number one, earthly rulers must not enforce any kind of worship. Worship has to do with the conscience of the individual and their creator. And the moment civil authorities gets between the conscience and the creator of any person, they have stepped out of their jurisdiction and they're playing God. God said, I'm going to deliver you over into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. He is my servant. You know, be that instrument by which judgment will be brought upon them. But despite that, Nebuchadnezzar was not given the authority to enforce any kind of worship. That is why in Daniel chapter 3, the 3 Hebrew boys were thrown in fire because they would not worship the golden image. And God stepped in and said, these are mine. You have no business enforcing worship. Second lesson in Daniel chapter, the book of Daniel, earthly rulers should recognize that their power is given them by the will and providence of God. Power and authority must not become an occasion for self-exaltation. Chapter 4. Notice the parallel prophetic chapters are 2, 7, 8, and 9, and 10 to 12. But in between these, we're looking at the lessons that are being brought out in between these prophetic chapters. Chapter 4, self-exaltation caused Nebuchadnezzar, the highest monarch, the most powerful monarch in the world, to become like a wild beast, like a wild goat living in the woods, unshaven for 7 years, eating bush, eating grass. Earthly rulers should recognize that their power is given them by the will, the permissive will and providence of God, and power and authority must not become an occasion for self-exaltation. Lesson number 3, Daniel chapter 5. Earthly dominion places in the hands of rulers the responsibility to serve their subjects. So when God permissively allows them to set up governments, it's not for the purpose of exploitation and religious intolerance, but to serve. Power and position must not be used as an opportunity to indulge selfish gratification. What we saw when Belshazzar had this feast and dishonored God, even to the point of desecrating the vessels that were taken from the temple when Jerusalem was sacked many years earlier, 70 years earlier. Then we see that he had to see the handwriting on the wall. Babylon was overthrown that very night. The fourth great lesson from the book of Daniel: earthly powers must not use their authority to forbid worship. Darius too, what did he do? Put Daniel in lion's den because he prayed to his God. He was set up to do so. And those who did the setting up ended up in the lion's den. Apparently the lions were not hungry when Daniel was there. God miraculously made them comfortable. I could imagine Daniel sleeping in the lion's den, resting his head on one of the lions. I think a lion would make a good pillow. Try it in the new earth. You might be able to find that out in the new earth. A good pillow for Daniel. But when the ones who set him up went in, the lions were now hungry. It was now their God's time, their idol's time to protect them. And they couldn't. So finally, when all nations pass the limits of divine forbearance, Christ takes his great power and he reigns. Daniel 12:1. And all of history has been moving towards this great climactic event. So if we study the book of Daniel, understanding these four great lessons that we see in chapters 3, 4, 5, and 6, and we study the book of Daniel, understanding the four parallel prophecies, recognizing that they have to do with restoration of the kingdom, restoration of the king, restoration of the sanctuary, and the sanctuary meaning the heavenly sanctuary, the king meaning Christ the true king, the kingdom meaning we know God's king, and notice, and restoration of the people. We will study the book of Daniel intelligently and come away with an understanding which will be far above and beyond that which you will typically find in many prophetic seminars on the book of Daniel and even Revelation. All right. Very good thought so far. I want to, like I said, we're going to take this in such a way that we're not overwhelming. We're going to just, is everybody clear so far?
Amen.
Praise the Lord.
Amen.
All right, let's go forward now. The Persian Empire, Daniel chapter 11 now, verses 1 and 2. This is how Daniel 11 starts now. Also, I, in the first year of Darius the Mede, so he was a Median king, he was the king over the empire, over many countries, more than 127 countries. Darius the Mede, he was a Median king. He says, even I stood to confirm and to strengthen him. So this is Gabriel talking to Daniel, and Gabriel said, Daniel, when Darius was in power, I stood to confirm and to strengthen him. Medo-Persian history is spanned in these two verses, chapters 1 and 2, in Daniel 11. Verse 2 says, and now I will show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than they all. And by his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of the Greeks, Grecia. So what we see in these two verses, 1 and 2, the history of Medo-Persia. And stirring up the anger of the Greeks, later to be overthrown by the Greeks. So the reign of Darius was honored by God, because to Darius was sent, the angel Gabriel was sent to him. We read this in Patriarchs and Prophets, Prophets and Kings, page 556. It says, the reign of Darius was honored by God. To him was sent the angel Gabriel to confirm and to strengthen him. That is what we say in verse 1 right here. But why? Because they had now conquered Babylon and they had taken over, and it was coming to the time that Israel should be freed. After a reign of 2 years, Darius died, and he was succeeded by Cyrus, who was already being considered, who has, we touched on Cyrus in many other studies. Cyrus was prophesied by Jeremiah. God told him that he will be the one who shall free my people. So there were different kings who came. Cyrus came and then delivered the Jews, sent them back into their, to their land to rebuild their city and rebuild their temple. After Cyrus, there were some other kings who came up after Cyrus' time. Notice verse 2 says, and I will now show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia. So the Medes and the Persians had a joint military coalition. They had intermarried their daughters and their sons. They had become friends so that they united together to overthrow Babylon. And having overthrown Babylon, Darius, the first king of the Medes, the Median kingdom, he became the first king of the empire. Cyrus was his son-in-law. Darius was about 60-something years old, 60 years old or 62 years old. And so 2 years later, he died. And Cyrus, now his son-in-law, who was the king of the Persians, became king of the empire. What you find is that when you look back at the prophetic parallels below, for example, in Daniel chapter 7, you saw a he-goat, Daniel chapter 8, a he-goat. And it came after, you had the rough goat, whatever, came after the other one, after the ram, and they said he went into him and he destroyed him. That's one power coming up against another power. And it says the horns, it said there are 2 horns, one came up after the other one. And the one which came up after was greater or bigger, a bigger horn. The Medes and the Persians, but then the Medes were usually, I mean, superior to the Persians. They were like a more sophisticated empire. But then after Darius died and the Persians came in, and gradually they were still allies, but the Persians came to the forefront. The second horn became greater than the other one. Now, the point is that you see this also with the bear in Daniel chapter 2. It says the bear, leaning on one side, it had 3 ribs in its mouth. Those 3 ribs represent the 3 major kingdoms that were conquered by Medo-Persia in order to come to power: Lydia, Egypt, and Babylon. And now it was leaning on one side, the bear, because in other words, one side was lower than the other, but eventually the Persians became, more influential than Medes. So the kings that we find coming after now will be Persian kings over the empire instead of Median kings. It says, "Now I will show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia. And the 4th," yes, you've heard about that one, "he shall be far richer than they all. And by his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of the Greeks." All right. So Cyrus came to the kingdom, and then some kings followed him. That's the quotation we just read from Patriarchs and Prophets. Some kings followed Cyrus. No, the 4 kings who followed Cyrus. These 2 verses that we're looking at, Daniel chapter 11, verses 1 and 2, that's the part of Daniel 11 that deals with the Medo-Persian Empire. Because after that, we're going into Greece. So just 2 verses summarizes the Medo-Persian Empire in Daniel 11. The 4 kings, Cambyses. After Cyrus passed, Cambyses came in. He reigned from 530 to 522 BC. Then Smerdis, 522 BC. Notice he didn't last long. Historians call him false Smerdis because he was said to be an impostor. I guess he didn't last long. He was ousted, an impostor to the throne. After that, so that's why it says 3 kings, because I guess this one wasn't counted. Then after that, you have Darius the Great, 522 to 486 BC. Another Darius, probably maybe named after his grandfather or whatever, that it was a Median king earlier. And then you have Xerxes, 486 to 475 BC, coming down the line. We're told in page Prophets and Kings, page 572. So I'm putting in some quotations here and there to confirm what we're talking about here as we're touching on Daniel 11. It says the forces of evil which were working against the Jews were held in check all the days of Cyrus and all the days of his son Cambyses, who reigned about 7.5 years. Force of evil. So this was the force of evil against the Jews because they were friendly towards the Jews. Cyrus freed the Jews to go back home and rebuild their city. And his son Cambyses and all that. He said they were hospitable towards the Jews who were in captivity. They freed them. But the thing about it is that the Jews did not take full advantage of this favorable period. Selfishness and lack of faith hindered them from speedily restoring their earthly temple. So in 522 BC, what happened here? The throne of Persia was seized, an uprising, seized by a Median, who pretended to be Smerdis, false Smerdis. He was the brother of Cambyses, known to the Jews as Artaxerxes. And he received from the Samaritans unfavorable report about the Jews, Immediately he issued, this is Artaxerxes, immediately issued a letter commanding the Jews to cease building the temple. So the enemies of God's people had favor in their behalf through the political powers at that time, because the Jews were dropping the ball. They were not going forward, to do the rebuilding project. They were sleeping on the job. But divine providence intervened. Because Darius the Great, we see that the number 3 right there, he ascended the throne only 8 months after, when the impostor was ousted. And so the Jews were once again encouraged. Haggai was prophesying. Haggai 5 verse 2, you see that, or thereabouts 5:20 or something like that. You see them rebuilding. They just start rebuilding project again. Because they had stopped the rebuilding. It was stopped. And now they started to rebuild again. They were now encouraged. Haggai was prophesying and Zechariah was prophesying. And so the Jews resumed building. And when the Samaritans saw the work of God moving forward, that was when they had petitioned Darius to stop the Jews. They petitioned Darius now to stop the Jews. But Darius, being a Persian, he was more sympathetic to the Jews. And he went and he searched the records, he searched the scrolls, and he found the decree of Cyrus, giving them freedom to go back and rebuild. And so he issued a further decree which confirmed and strengthened the decree of Cyrus. You can see this in Ezra chapter 6. And so the temple was completed in 516 BC during the reign of Darius the Great. And the fourth king after Cyrus was Xerxes. We see right there. The Bible says, we just read that in Daniel 11 verse 2, he was far richer than all the others. And he marshaled the resources of his kingdom, of his empire. And he formed a great military campaign. And he engaged in one of the biggest military campaigns of ancient times in all of history. He had many soldiers, easily a million or more soldiers, many soldiers. But even though he had many soldiers, he had few warriors. What is the difference between soldiers and warriors? Soldiers are willing to fight. Warriors are willing to fight to the last. If they're just merely soldiers, just enlisted because you're trying to put together a big army quickly, and they are not dedicated to the mission, what happens when they get afraid and they see that the battle is turning? They turn and run. So he had a huge army, many soldiers, but not many warriors. This was a hireling army. He hired them to come fight. And so a small force, relatively much smaller force, 10 times smaller even, of the Greeks who were warriors, repulsed them and defeated this great military campaign of Xerxes here. This rich, wealthy one. Now, this Xerxes was known to the Jews as Ahasuerus. You can see Ahasuerus in the book of Esther. And he's the last Persian king mentioned in Daniel 11. It was during his reign that a decree was passed to exterminate all the Jews throughout the empire. That is where the book of Esther fits into this whole picture. It was happening during his reign. Unfortunately, God had arranged matters to meet the emergency. Queen Esther was a Jewess, and because of her intercession before the king, God's people were spared. We know the story of Esther. It was Xerxes' son, whose name was Artaxerxes, Longimanus, mean long-handed. He's calling the long-handed one. Artaxerxes, Xerxes' son, Artaxerxes Longimanus, who issued the third decree, the final decree to restore and to rebuild Jerusalem. This is the one that is spoken of in Daniel chapter 9, 24 to 27. 70 weeks have been given to your people to clean up their acts and whatever, and to do this and to do that and do this. He says, until the going forth of the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince shall be 62 weeks, and it goes on and on. That decree spoken of there in Daniel chapter 9, 24 to 27, that is the third decree to restore and to rebuild Jerusalem, giving them a political autonomy, that they can now govern themselves, put in public officials, and put in their own justice system and govern themselves. So it was not just a rebuilding of the walls and rebuilding of the temple, it was a restoration, which means putting in their whole infrastructure and functioning as an independent nation to restore and to rebuild Jerusalem. As long as the Medo-Persian Empire fulfilled heaven's purposes, angelic forces from God were sent to fight on their behalf. In other words, when I say fight, we understand. Gabriel said to Daniel, you know, you were praying for 3 weeks now, and from the time you started to pray, Daniel, the command came to me naturally from the commander of angels, Christ, the archangel, and he says to come and to answer your prayer. But I was what word he used? He said I was in battle with you know, the prince of Persia. In other words, it was not a battle of swords and physical fight. It was coming up to the time, it had come to the time when the Jews should be freed, and Satan, knowing that, didn't want them to be freed, because they would be freed, go back, build their city, and the Messiah would come through the prophecy through them some centuries later. And Satan was doing everything to prevent the prophecy of the Messiah. So he had his demons, and he himself was right there on the ground. And what was he doing? He was influencing the mind of the king through his advisors. In other words, the Congress and the Senate, and if you're in Britain, you call it Parliament, all the parliamentarians, they were there telling the king, don't free these Jews. Do you know what it is to have them a free source of labor and whatever? Don't give them freedom. They're going to rebel against the empire. Satan was doing everything to prevent him. And Gabriel was there trying to influence Cyrus. And Daniel was in the battle too. How was Daniel battling? He was praying. 21 days fasting and praying. And, you know, Gabriel said, but Michael, your prince, came. And what usually happens when Christ shows up? Satan and his demons flee. The battle was won right there, but the war still goes on. But the battle was won. Cyrus signed the decree and freed the Jews to go back home. We're spending time on this. We're taking our time. I'm deliberately taking my time, just looking at the history of it. We've only touched on 2 verses so far because we want to get the background. And this is something we're going to go over and discuss till it becomes clear. It's crucially important. We're dealing with the restoration of God's people. Now, notice Prophets and Kings, page 502. The Medo-Persian realm was visited by the wrath of heaven because in it God's law had been trampled underfoot. Remember Daniel was thrown in the lion's den? The fear of the Lord had found no place in the hearts of the vast majority of the people. Wickedness, blasphemy, and corruption prevailed. So God could no longer be upholding them and keeping them as an instrument to, you know, to do it at that time. When I say instrument, I mean from the civil end of it, not as a prophet like his anointed prophets. So when we look at that now, we come to verse 3 of Daniel chapter 11. Verses 3 to verse 15 deals with the Greek Empire. Notice now, and a mighty king shall stand up and shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. Who is this mighty king? Alexander the Great. Notice what we read over here. He said he shall do what? Verse 2 here, he shall, this king, the final king of the Medo-Persian Empire, by his strength and through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Grecia, of the Greeks. And that was the battle in which a smaller force of the Greeks decimated his army. And he went back to his kingdom with his, as they would say, his tail between his legs, as an expression of being properly whipped. So prophecy was being fulfilled. History was being made. And now relatively small force, nation was gaining in power and becoming mightier and mightier, coming out of nowhere. The Greeks. And the ruling empire, because they had rejected God and trampled upon his law, and the people had become so wicked, that was the Medo-Persian Empire, was now being decimated. Greek was coming to the forefront now. The Greeks under this mighty king here, Daniel 11 verse 3, Alexander the Great. It is not difficult to recognize Alexander the Great in this scripture. The king of Grecia, he marched into Asia Minor with a little money and little resources, a small force, about 3,500 men. I'm sorry, 35,000 men, compared to hundreds of thousands that he was coming against. 35,000 men, but he was a brilliant military strategist. And although he was vastly outnumbered, by the forces of Darius II, he quickly routed the Persians in 3 decisive battles. The Battle of Granicus, 335 BC, the Battle of Issus, 333 BC, that's only 2 years later, and the Battle of Arbela, 331 BC, and Medo-Persia was no longer the ruling empire. So this mighty king stood up, Alexander the Great. He was a very capable general. He knew how to conquer a world, but he could not conquer himself. So he overdosed on some alcohol. So he spent the next 5 years consolidating his kingdom, and shortly after that, he overdosed. Alexander the Great. Notice this. This is from James Henry Breasted, Ancient Times, History of the Early World, pages 505 to 507. This is what he says. Speaking of Alexander the Great, he said, undoubtedly, his vision of himself had grown as his power grew. His ego was growing too, until he saw himself as more than human. Many a great Greek had come to be recognized as a god. And there was, in Greek belief, no sharp line between dividing gods from men. You know, men would come and become gods according to Greek beliefs. The East would accept the deification of Alexander as a matter of course, because it had for ages been customary to regard the kings as divine in Egypt, where he was held to be the son of the sun god. Alexander was looked upon like a god. How could a man take 35,000 men and defeat over 1 million men, pretty much? He must be a god, and so they worshipped him. And he said, let me show you what gods do when they're not really gods. He overdosed and killed himself. Now, Alexander the Great, it goes on. Same reference continues. As an outward observance, vividly suggesting his character as a god, he adopted the Oriental requirement that all who approached him on official occasions should bow down to the earth and kiss his feet. Kind of sounds like somebody today who's the head of a religious system, doesn't he? The practices of all these kingdoms all reside in the papacy today. That's why Daniel 7 verse 12 says, concerning the rest of the kingdoms, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were preserved for a season and time. Because in the papacy, you find all these practices brought down into a religious system today. So they come and they kiss his feet. He also sent formal notifications to all the Greek cities that the league of which he had been head was dissolved, and he was henceforth to be officially numbered among the gods of each city. And that as such, he was to receive the state offerings which each city presented. So they had to now make sacrifices to Alexander the Great. But this would, his exaltation of himself as God too, was bound to bring him into serious conflict with God's people. Because they're not going to worship a man, the true people of God. They would refuse to worship Alexander the Great. So what Satan was doing, he was engineering matters for another effort to try to exterminate the Jews. The one during the time of Esther had failed, and he was trying to set up another one to exterminate them. He was doing everything to prevent the prophecy of the Messiah's coming from being fulfilled. But divine providence interposed. In the year 323 BC, while only at the age of 32 years of age, Alexander fell victim to fever because of his own intemperance. He drank that liquor, a huge goblet, because they bet him that he couldn't do it. And I guess the god died from overdosing himself. And he died at the very time when he was in Babylon. He was dreaming of rebuilding Babylon and rebuilding that center of civilization. Remember, when Babylon was destroyed, God prophesied through the prophets that Babylon would never be inhabited again. It would never be rebuilt. And to this day, it has not been. Alexander decided he was going to prove all that Hebrew prophecy wrong. And so he was in Babylon to rebuild Babylon and to show that Jehovah's word means nothing. And right there in Babylon, he overdosed himself. And he died. All right. So notice this. And when he shall stand up, that's speaking of Alexander's exalting himself as a god. When he shall stand up, this is Daniel 8. Now the very next verse, Daniel 11 verse 4, sorry, verse 4, the next verse. When he shall exalt himself, when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken and shall be divided towards the four winds of heaven, and not to his posterity. His son won't get the throne, in other words, nor according to his dominion which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be plucked up even for others beside his posterity. So when the he-goat waxed great, when he was very strong, the great horn was broken, and out of it came up four horns, four notable horns, the Bible says, towards the winds of heaven. Four kingdoms shall stand out of this nation. So when we look at the green part on this map here, this kind of looking at Alexander's empire, the extent of it, covering a huge region. I mean, not Alexander. All of this you're seeing here was the Alexander's empire. But when he died, his kingdom was divided. The four generals started fighting among each other, and they decided to make a truce. And then they divided the empire into the orange section, the green section, this section, that's it. And four sections came out of Alexander Empire. The four sections of the four generals. Anybody knows the name of those four generals? Seleucus, Cassander, Lysimachus, and Ptolemy. Those are the four generals that decided, look, instead of killing each other to be the next Alexander, why don't we just stop the fighting, split the empire in four, you keep that region, you keep that, and that's what eventually did. The Bible says the great horn will be broken, and out of it four notable horns will come up. The kingdom was divided into four. All right. So the whole empire was convulsed in a series of wars as the generals fought for dominion. And Alexander's heir, his son, his next of kin, instead of him coming to the throne, he was murdered to prevent him from going to the throne. It says the kingdom shall be divided towards the four winds of heaven, and not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled. So not even his son got the throne, and his dominion which he ruled, it was divided among four people. They formed an alliance, they overthrew the one who would have succeeded, and then they split up the kingdom for themselves. So these are four permanent geographical divisions. And it took time for all this to happen. It didn't just happen instantly after his death. It took about 40, 80 years for all of this to happen. And these four distinct sections emerged as four distinct sections. We're going to be wrapping up in just a few minutes now, because we just want to spend a few minutes and answer during the questions here. We're just touching on the history. Remember that this is not just about history, it's about the restoration of God's people, but we want to get into the history of it, and it becomes more and more relevant to us and as we go further into it. But let's lay the foundation of looking at the history, what the earlier verses of Daniel 11 is talking about. Now, according to one historian, the wars had finally resulted about 275 BC in a permanent division in accord with geographical conditions. The Seleucid Empire in the Asia, the east, the empire of the Ptolemies in Egypt in the south, Egypt and Syria in the south, Macedon under the Antigonids west, and Pergamum under the Attalids north. But these four, the Antigonian Empire, Antigonids, didn't last. Eventually, you had the four that I just mentioned, this under Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy. So these four sections that Alexander's empire divided into, they remain distinct remnants of Alexander's empire until each was later incorporated into the Roman Empire. when Rome took over later on. Right after verse 15, that's when Rome comes in. But let's just take this to three more slides. Three more slides, and then we wrap up. Daniel 11:5. And the king of the south shall be strong, and one of his princes, and he shall be strong, and he shall be strong above him and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. In other words, the spotlight of prophecy, right till we get to verse 5, the spotlight turns to the two most prominent divisions of Alexander's empire, the north and the south. They had 4 divisions, but one guy decided, look, if I do a sneak attack over on that empire, that division, and I conquer them with a surprise attack, then I will have half of the empire and I can easily wipe out the other 2. So he went to do that. And when he went and he conquered the other empire, on his way back home with his army, he was bushwhacked by one of the other 2 who knew what was happening, and they waited him when they were coming with all their spoils and victory and everything. They were not prepared to war. They had already fought and they were coming home celebrating. They were bushwhacked and they were defeated. So the kingdom in the north basically conquered him. And since he had conquered the other one, you had now all of that being merged into what you would consider the kingdom of the north. And down in the south, if you look at the map of it all, down in the south, that's down here, this region, if you can see my cursor, down in Arabia, down here, you have Egypt. I mean, over here, Egypt down here, the kingdom of the north over in this section, and the kingdom of the south down this section. So it's soon, the 4 divisions soon morphed into 2, the northern section and the southern section. Why am I saying this? Because as you continue in Daniel 11, you're going to see talk about the kingdom of the north and the kingdom of the south. The empire that had bushwhacked the other one that went to attack the other one, that was the Seleucid Empire. On the, Seleucus was one of the generals, Seleucid Empire. And then the one in the south was the Egypt, and so was the Ptolemaic Empire. So you had the kingdom of the north, the Seleucid Empire, and you have the kingdom of the south, the Ptolemaic Empire. And those were the 2 contending kingdoms right now. So the north would come down and attack the south would go back up and attack the north. But they came to a point where they decided, you know what? We want to form a truce, an alliance, so that we stop attacking each other. And so notice verse 6 of Daniel 11. There was a marriage alliance formed. And in the end of years, they shall join themselves together. For the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. Notice this. The king of the Ptolemaic Empire, the daughter, was married to, notice, the king of the north. We'll talk about this next week. To form an alliance between the 2 kingdoms so that they will be at peace with each other. But it says, but she shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand nor his arm, but she shall be given up, and they that brought her, and he that begat her, and he that strengthened her in these times. What happened? Let me put it in a nutshell. We're going to end right here, because we're going to pick up back right here. This king in the south says, look guys, let's form a truce. Let's get along. Let's do what people do even today. Let's intermarry our 2 kingdoms so that we become now related and we form a truce between our 2 empires. So the daughter of the king of the south, they formed an agreement, and she would be married to the king of the north. The king of the north was already married. And so when he met this beautiful southerner, he decided to put his wife out and to marry her. In fact, the king of the north was Antiochus II. And he marries the daughter of the king of the north. Her name was Berenice. She was the daughter of Ptolemy II, Ptolemy Philadelphus II, the daughter of the king of the south. But when she went, when the marriage went up, the king of the north, Antiochus II, he put his wife out. and marries this person. She had children for him. I mean, his wife that he put out, she had a son for him, but he put her out, he married her because he wanted to forge an alliance with the South. But, you know, after a while, some years, I guess he started missing his wife that he put out. And so he took her back in. I guess he took her back in. And she decided that, look, you humiliated me. I can't trust you again. So she set him up and had him assassinated. And in having him assassinated, so that her son could come in to be the next king. She said, you've embarrassed me. You've done this to me. She had the king assassinated. That's why it says, this daughter of the king of the South, she shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand. Neither shall Antiochus II stand. Because his ex-wife, now when she was restored, she assassinated him, put her son in to be the new king. And guess what she did to the daughter of the king of the South? Had her assassinated too, and all her entourage or whatever, all her entourage that came with her from the South, had all of them assassinated. That's why it says, but she shall be given up, and they that brought her, and he that begat her, and he that strengthened her in these times. She said, look, you are the cause of all my troubles. She assassinated the king, poisoned him or whatever, put her son and wiped out his new wife from the South and everything. That is why when we get to the next verse, you see the new king, the son that was now put in place. I'm sorry, you see the king of the South coming up with an army to the north. Why? He has come now. Now the sister who was killed, who had gone to the north, her brother had now become king of the South. And he made a huge army and marched to the north to revenge his sister's death. And so the fight between the king of the north and the king of the South kept going. But when we come to later to the end, we'll realize that the king of the north and the king of the South is no longer representing geographical regions. We will see what it represents. So it's important. We're just following I guess you can call this the daytime soap part of this. The different squabblings going on and intermarriage and all that stuff. Just following the first few verses, taking our time as we seek to establish the historical backdrop of all of this. And then we get into the other parts next week. So